conferência, que será a última desta série de seminários do Mestrado em Desenvolvimento e Cooperação Internacional. Eu tenho um enorme gosto de apresentar a professora Sindzingre. A professora Sindzingre trabalha connosco há mais de long time ago, 30 years with this master, com este mestrado. É uma especialista em economia do desenvolvimento, economia política, e uma especialista de terreno, the land of research is mainly Africa, African Studies. A professora Sindzingre, hoje, como tiveram a oportunidade de ler na nota biográfica, ela é investigadora do Centro de Economia de Paris Norte, Universidade de Paris Norte, em França, do Centro de Investigação Lama, Áfricas no Mundo, da Universidade de Bordeaux, Universidade de Bordeaux, e é também investigadora associada do CEsA, do nosso centro. Mas a professora Sindzingre, durante a sua vida de investigação, foi investigadora do Centro Nacional de Investigação Científica, CNRS, Centre National de Recherche Scientifique, e foi também, durante 20 anos, professora convidada na School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, School of University of London, onde ensinou, where she loves,
I don't speak Portuguese.
Yes, I know, where you teach mainly African economy, and then she's always with us.
Absolutely.
Elle est toujours avec nous, maintenant en anglais, il y a 30 ans en français, quand on avait cette capacité de parler deux langues, et maintenant in English. So thank you so much. The title is Change, Language and Power, Theories and Policies of International Financial Institutions. Thank you so much, Alice.
Merci, Johanna. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Absolutely. And you will see that my English is not exactly at the same level as the Portuguese English today, because the French continue to speak very bad English, which is not the case of Portuguese people today, who are now oriented to the vast world. I am not a fan of Zoom. I have to adapt after 2 years of Zoom. And let us start. And Mariana, you have the... So before we do all the technical things, I don't know your background, and so this paper it's a paper I would like to publish when I will have time. My background is economics, but not only economics, development economics, but also in the past I was a philosopher, a linguist, so I traveled in different disciplines, and I will talk about quite a few things, but I would like to be sure that it is things you already have a background in the... So has everybody some background in development economics or development studies, or just, is it familiar to you? I mean, international financial institutions, Africa, World Bank,
yes,
IMF, all this. Okay. Linguistics, maybe not, but it is precisely what could be original in this paper. Thank you very much, Mariana. Thank you. So I will take 1 hour in my best English. And so, as Joanna said, this is a critical paper regarding the impact, the role, the policies of international financial institutions, and especially in Africa. As you know, I mean, the literature regarding international financial institutions, World Bank and IMF, is absolutely enormous for, let's say, 40 or 50 years since the first stabilization and adjustment program in Africa. This is absolutely, there are billions of papers on critical papers, especially on this issue. I will try to present critical ideas regarding the IFI policy in Africa in a perspective which I hope you are not completely familiar with, I hope, which is focusing on the role of language. And I think that is something which is absolutely not familiar to mainstream economists, of course, but even in development studies, strangely, by the way, the very fact that we use language to communicate for any relationship is something which is perceived as a transparent, as a neutral issue. And I would like to insist that we can have a powerful critique of the role of IFI in Africa and mainstream economics in general in taking seriously language. But it's huge. And the second idea which was behind this paper was beyond the linguistics, philosophical, economics perspective, the global financial crisis and the fact that the IFI recently, let's say over the last 10 years, and of course, even more with COVID, which is accelerated this type of discourse, the IFI, World Bank, IMF, to put it shortly, claimed to have changed, and especially since the famous global financial crisis, 2008 GFC. And they claim powerfully in their website, in their policy papers, in the theoretical papers accompanying IFI policy, we have changed. The global financial crisis has been a seismic event. Like the Queen said, they didn't see that coming. You remember? No, they didn't see that coming. So they apologized and they said, we have changed. We have devised new analysis, new tools, new theoretical tools for analyzing development economics, but also we have devised new policies, new reform program, etc. And reading this type of papers, I have been a bit surprised because, in fact, I said maybe, in fact, they didn't change so much. And so, how to analyze this type of possibility of change or not? This paper will argue, and I will come to this, that in fact the change is very, very tenuous, and the change. But of course, I'm not a journalist, and it's not enough to say they didn't change. And goodbye. So I will try to argue and to give you some analytical tools for understanding change and how to think that something, any entity, any abstract concept, any institution has changed or not. So, and this is and precisely this is why I think linguistics, language, and different conceptual tools can be useful. So I start precisely, and that is, if we use words such as change, power, language, about what are we talking about? And I started with a picture because it is fashionable to start with a picture. There will be no anime, no picture, no photograph, because I am a very old school person, but at least the slide one have one. And you will see, I am an absolute fan of Escher. You recognize Escher. So the picture of Escher from here to here, so I had to concentrate a bit. It was impossible to put it in a slide, but at least you see something absolutely incredible, which is a possibility to conceptualize change. So clearly, in this wonderful picture by Escher, you see the notion of small change, small incremental changes. And if you take the two extremities, you can see two A and B, which are absolutely heterogeneous, absolutely different, but at the same time, the human mind, the human cognition is absolutely unable to identify exactly where the change is. So I could put a title which is identical, but in fine, different. At the same time, we think about time and passé and all this. Below, we have something which is an identical person. We can postulate that Orson Welles is the same person from the birth to death. I mean, it is a philosophical assumption that it may be the same person, but you immediately see that what is one of the effects of time is it is quite difficult for many people, me included, to see any similarity between that representation, which is a representation, it is a photography of one person at, let's say, different time of its life. We assume that it is, we see exactly here a representation of identity, but with a perception of absolute difference. Okay, so at least we can see two, and there are of course many, two illustration that in fact, if we talk about change, we talk about extremely complex issues. That is, we should know first, and economists usually are not interested at all by this, of what is change and about what are we talking. So what is the argument? The argument of the paper, which I hope to publish one day, as I said, so the claim by IFI that, and even more today after COVID, we change, we adapt, we adjust to change, global change in the world, etc., etc. So it has been the point of departure, my surprise vis-a-vis this type of claim. So as I said, I reacted and said it's really a matter of debate, and what is a genuine change? What is it to talk about something A as change into B, etc. And it is quite relevant because, as you know, the literature is very critical about the impact of IFI in Africa. And this type of question is not a pure abstract question. That is, it is quite important for us to know if, and especially for Africa, but I would say exactly the same for the whole world, the developing world, that is, did they change or not? I mean, is it something which is true, or is it pure claim or window dressing, or etc.? Because again and again, the impact on the real world is not an abstract question, is absolutely crucial. That is, do we observe in 2022 exactly the repetition of more or the same, or something which is hopefully a bit different from the first adjustment program starting in Africa, as you know, in the 80s. And in the 80s, it's quite a long time ago. So we should know and understand and have the tools regarding was there a change over half a century or not. So this is, I think, a crucial question. And as I said, what is important is to start first with how can we define change. So to put it broadly, because it is an argument and the introduction, to put it broadly, at least we can have an extreme regarding the concept of change, a very large change, very visible change, let us say à la Kuhn, classically the famous paradigm change, which has been popularized by Kuhn. So this is typically what ordinary language call as change, a shift in paradigm. So, okay, is Earth flat or is it round? So this is typical example of a paradigm shift. So this is a spectacular change. But to go back to development, other concept of change may be put forward. And for instance, it has been the case by Hirschman, that is change, exactly what you trying to show with the Escher graph figures. Transformation may occur via small change. So this is a legitimate, it's a plausible view of change. And of course, immediately you see that your analysis of the change within the IFI will absolutely not be the same if you take one particular conception of change or the other. That is, Hirschman, but it's not the only one, has conceptualized in many books that change may take place via small bifurcation, small innovation, small departures, via, these are the word of Hirschman, partial, limited, and pragmatic responses, typically. And Hirschman insists, which is quite relevant, by the way, on the fact that change is something which can be very erratic, like a Brownian movement. You see, that is, it is not so clear to observe a change because it can be something quite erratic. So another point regarding change is, of course, It's a very superficial to say that. But of course, if we talk about change, and I'm sure that you think immediately about that, I was quoting the 80s and 2022, immediately your reaction is to say, what is the time span? I mean, it is clear that we were talking with Joanna about the absolute tremendous change over the last 2 years. So at least we can touch it, that is Zoom, etc. Real change, yes. So what will be the time span? That is, you can observe the change overnight, typically a devaluation of a currency. This is a change you observe overnight. You see, you go to bed and the day after, your currency, your savings is divided by, let's say, 1,000%. So you see the change. It is an overnight change. But of course, let's say an institution, and this is typically what Brodel, the famous historian, so I'm burning what I'm going to say later, but the time span is quite important because typically some institutions, they change over 5 centuries. So if you take, for instance, gender inequality, I don't even think that 5 centuries is not enough. You see, maybe we can start at the Paleolithic time to observe change. So let's say 20,000 years is not. So typically, the time span is absolutely crucial for having a serious conception of time. Typically, the time span is crucial. What is the you may not observe any change depending on the time span. And so classically, Brodel said that institutions are things which are changing the most slowly, which is not completely true because again and again, if you have a revolution, and the French are well placed to talk about a revolution, you can see that overnight, you behead the king, usually it is really changing institution quite quickly. So this is really one criteria. Short-term, time span, short-term, long-term, etc. So this is the third complexity in how can we think about change. So what is the argument of the paper? Because I was facing the claim of the IFI, we have changed in the GFC, global financial crisis, COVID, etc. And I tried to put forward in this paper that we can trap IFI to their own discourse, in the sense that consequentialism is typically an IFI position, that is only consequence matter. You see, you take any mainstream policy in Portugal or in Angola or whatever country, that is consequence matter. We do, or in France, what matters is the consequence. Maybe you cannot have an omelette sans casser deux. How do you say that in Portuguese? This is a Chinese sentence. Mao Zedong. On ne fait pas, any revolutionary person in any case say we cannot have omelette without casser deux. How do you say in English? Exactly. So that is typically consequentialist, which is a philosophical position, is a typical position of any mainstream, and typically of people who have the power because they justify what they did by consequences. This is what is called in philosophy consequentialist, only consequence matter. And the conclusion of this paper will say that the IFI, in fact, are typically consequentialist institutions because they say, oh, it is true that our policy reform can make many people suffer. Many civil servants will be laid off, but it is for reaching the fiscal balance of the budget. The union will be dismantled, but it is for the good of, I know that it is talking to Portuguese people, etc. That is, you agree that consequentialism is absolutely a typical position of mainstream policy, not even the IFI, that is, judge me at the consequence. We were talking about France. Macron will go back again to the retirement reform. Like in any country, reforming retirement will be painful reform, like many reforms, but any policymaker say, wait, precisely wait. You see, time is always the crucial issue. Wait, in 1 year, 2 years, etc. You will see positive results. And in fact, the pain will be a provisional pain. Do you agree that it is the absolute basis of most policy makers. So consequentialism is a typical position of any policy maker. And the point of the paper is to say, okay, let us accept this consequentialist position, and we will analyze Africa before IFI policy, after IFI policy. And you will see the paper, nothing has changed. We can use exactly the consequentialist position of the IFI. Take Sub-Saharan Africa in 1960. You will see a graph which is absolutely depressing of Africa with an absolute flat GDP per capita in 1960, and it is exactly the same GDP per capita in real terms in 1922. So the point of the paper is to say, I take seriously the consequentialist, which is not a personal position, by the way, but, and you will see, okay, you prefer the consequentialist stance, you will see that even in your own paradigm of consequentialist, nothing has changed if we take outcomes, consequence, as the main criterion of change, which is, by the way, you know that consequentialist is classically opposed in philosophy to deontological stance, which is being moved by principles. You can drive your action. Either you judge by consequence. I have killed my, I don't know, my neighbor because, but it is for the good of the area, but because the neighbor was a very noisy person. So this is a consequentialist position. Or you are driven by deontology and typically Kantian principle. You say ex ante, it's bad to do this, and action should be not moved by consequences, but by principle. You see, this is a classical position. Anyway, I'm not, voilà. So I finished the argument to say exactly what I just said. That is, if we take a consequentialist change, we observe that in fact change have been incredibly limited over the last 50 years regarding the policy reform program of the IFI. And as I said, IFI claimed change, and they claim change in many levels. They claim change in theories, in words. That is, if you read the literature of the IMF, World Bank, etc., you go to their website, you will see, for instance, a typical use of new words. For instance, fragile states, or vulnerable states, or shocks, or what else? Plenty of new words, and which are very sympathetic, and where we have the impression that the IMF and the World Bank, in fact, take into account that these crises represent extremely risky and dangerous events for African economies. Vulnerability is really a word which has appeared immediately after the 2008 crisis. So I argue that words may change, theories may in appearance change, but in fact, outcomes remain absolutely identical, which is the first point. And the causal mechanism producing these outcomes, which is here we are in the real world, okay, in fact, are absolutely stable. What are these causal mechanisms? So the paper is not on real economy, but you know them, which is commodity dependence, typically depending on oil. I mean, half of African economies are oil-based. So IFI can claim whatever change in theories, the use of new concept, new word, etc. But the underlying causal mechanism in the real world, and I will put commodity dependence, low industrialization, all the things you perfectly know, are absolutely stable. And of course, this is a question over the last century. And this is a real world of causal mechanism, okay? But as I said, words and theory may change, but the policies, and it is what I'm going to present in this paper, the IFI policy are the same. What are they? Conditionality. Conditional lending is absolutely the same since the 80s and today. And I will produce some example of this literature, and you will see that the words are absolutely the same, which is we finance new financial, new mechanisms, financial facilities, etc., are produced extremely often by the IFI, but all of them, if you read the entire text, are for economies or government practicing the appropriate policy. Everybody knows what appropriate policy means. That is for the IFI, that is precisely my financing as an IFI is conditioned. It's a policy-based lending. It's a conditional lending, conditional to reform. That is, if privatization takes place, if the budget is reduced, if the fiscal balance, etc., is improved, etc., etc. So, theories, new words, causal mechanisms are absolutely stable, and the policies, if you read them, are in fact absolutely adequate. The paper will conclude with why, and I don't have the answer, by the way, because it's a absolutely immense, issue that is to understand. By the way, I hope we will discuss on that, to understand why this stability, which is, by the way, an incredibly deep and complex question. I remind that the IMF and the World Bank are populated by excellent economists. Everybody goes from the MIT or Harvard, etc. So the hypothesis that these people are not competent must be left. And of course, the issue is to try to understand such a stability, which I think it's a matter of debate, and which is, by the way, one of the stakes of such a paper. So more than a Hirschmanian transformation, the paper argues that the consequentialism can be a very good tool for precisely trapping the IFI to their own hypothesis. Okay, so now we move to the paper itself. That is the IFI. You know what are the IFI? So based on policy-linked lending. So I'm not stabilization adjustment program. So I'm not insisting on that because you know all this. You know, as I said, the enormous literature regarding the mixed. This is a World Bankies to speak like that. The mixed effect of IFI program. Which are mixed, yes, we have to be nuanced in any case. In some economies, African economies, reform IFI program got, let's say, positive effect. I mean, there are countries which were in such a dire situation, Ghana, for instance, or Benin, or that it may happen that the years after a particular reform program, we see graph and figure which are sometimes better than before, etc. So the literature is enormous, but it is usually quite critical for Africa. I mean, this is something everybody knows. The critique of conditional lending has been enormous also, and even within the mainstream literature, that is, conditional lending is a matter of critique since a very long time. What is interesting, even within the most mainstream literature in the US, with very interesting argument, by the way, which is one, for instance, like the Samaritan dilemma. I don't know if you know what it is. That is, I think it's an excellent critique coming from game theory, so it is a matter based on model. That is, conditional lending can never work because the knowing that a particular financing is conditioned to a particular policy, you should lay off your civil servant or privatize or whatever, the commodity board, etc. Knowing that a government may always not dragging the feet and saying it's not my fault, there was a war in Ukraine, there was a drought, there was a devaluation or whatever, and it's not our fault. And taking any particular event in the world and say interest rates are exploded, etc. And we would have loved to do it, but we couldn't do it. And it is impossible for the lender to say that it is not true. You cannot demonstrate that, in fact, the government had absolutely no intention, because you don't know the government, it's an opaque entity, and never intended to implement the policy. You see, the Samaritan dilemma is a variety of this, and the other variety of the Samaritan dilemma is that what is a lender? It is an entity which is based on the idea on the intention, on the mission, that it will give some financing. A lender which is not financing is not a lender anymore. You agree? I mean, just close and left. So knowing this, a government knows that in any case, whatever they do, in any case, the lender has to lend, which is a perfectly rational position. And this is an enormous incentive for not implementing the reform. You agree? Because you know that DFID, AFD, whatever bilateral entity, is based as a mission to finance development. So this is the most huge incentive for precisely not to implement the conditionality. This problem, and there are plenty of other problems, is quite well known, but I think it is an incredibly violent argument against condition. And even within the mainstream literature, many people say that condition can never work by definition. Anyway, so the literature is enormous regarding the fact that conditional lending IFI style is something which is not efficient, and the point is to insist that it is not dangerous. Leftists will say that, but even within the mainstream literature, how it worked for 50 years is something which is not necessarily efficient. So in this context, as I said, the IFI, after the global financial crisis, which has been, you were too young, but a real seismic event in 2008 and afterwards, that they couldn't say we do nothing. So they said we will adapt, we will help vulnerable economies, fragile economies, etc. And also, you cannot remember, but even before, you were again too young, 99, the poverty program, that is even before the global crisis in 2008, this capacity, this claim, we are very compassionate people, we adapt to change, to the global context, etc., is something which even took place before, because when adjustment program appeared extremely blatantly and clearly in the late 90s, that Africa GDP per capita was absolutely like a flat encephalogram, that they had to react. And you remember that in the late 90s, the adjustment and stabilization program changed their name. We go back to the idea of name, what is in a name, and became the poverty and growth program. You remember that poverty has been put like seeds, like cards. In any sentence, you have poverty every 10 words in any report to show that poverty, it was an incredible repetitive recurrence of a word. So it's not something which is recent. And remember, it was an adjustment to change in the global world. It was a time when civil society started to be extremely voicing in the 90s. NGO started to be more professional, Oxfam, etc. And the IFI could not at all not to react in the 90s. And so it's not a new story, but the global financial crisis has accelerated this claim for change in theory and policy. Okay, so there's claim to be adaptive. We adapt, and today we have environment, and COVID, etc. So there are plenty of reasons to claim for change. As I said, PRGT, adjustment became PRGT, poverty reduction, etc., etc. So it is a whole story. It went even further. That is, in the late 2000s, recently, 5 years ago, it went even further within the IFI, and some key names within the IFI, like Jonathan Ostry, for instance, within the IMF, Maurice Opseld, absolutely strategic and central person within the IMF, went even further, and a paper was published in 2016 saying that, which is something that really surprised readers, that the Ostry used, for instance, the word neoliberal policies have increased inequality. So everybody said, oh my God, the IMF is saying that neoliberal using, and again, what is in the name, what is in the word, because you agree that the word neoliberal was not exactly the most used word within the literature within the IMF. Even me, I don't use this word. So it was in the dissemination journal of the IMF, which is Finance and Development, which is supposed to be read by policy makers. Neoliberal policy have increased inequality. Oh my God, this is really a change. What happened? And affected durable expansion in Africa, etc. Within the IMF, Blanchard recently, Blanchard claimed that debt is good, and it has been published everywhere in the economies, the Financial Times, etc., that in fact, high level of debt can be acceptable, etc., which is really a change. Or Opsfeld saying that trade liberalization may hurt unless policies redistribute benefits. I mean, you say, oh my God, it's really a change. Trade, can you imagine? I mean, African citizens can really, when they read this, react. Trade can worsen the domestic income distribution. Serious scholars knew it, but it is, you have to understand that published within the IMF official paper, this is really a change, and we would have loved to know that before, maybe. So, new sentence, new causalities put forward, you see, in official papers, and new facilities, as I said, the poverty reduction and growth, many new facilities have been created immediately after the global financial crisis, and all based, I mean, you can skip the name, extended fund facility, rapid financing instrument, etc., especially for poor countries, so for low-income economies, and all precisely focus on the word rapid, quick reaction, reacting to domestic fragilities, reacting to brutal commodity price shocks. The idea, the key central names being vulnerability, and for vulnerability, quick reaction. You have to understand that it is something really new, in fact, in the vocabulary of the IFI, the idea of rapidity, rapid reaction. And everybody agrees. I mean, nobody can be against a rapid reaction to a shock. So it is presenting the institution as something adaptive and helping really low-income economies. So also the introduction, which is something, if you are interested, we can discuss later, of new words such as structural problems. And if you read carefully the literature, we have no time for that. Structural is in fact something which can be, I have to be careful on the words I use because it is on YouTube. Structural is at the same time used in the IFI literature to talk about very deep reforms, which can be so deep that in fact the entire economy will be intended to change completely. For instance, privatization of everything, which is a structural reform, moving from a state-led economy to a private sector-led economy. But at the same time, it is a sympathetic word in the sense that heterodox economists also talk about structural change. And they talk, and when they say structural, it is in a different meaning, and saying IMF reform will never work if they don't take into account structural issues such as commodity dependence. I just wanted to highlight that here we have typically a very dangerous ambiguity, and this is what, again, I would like to make you sensitive to this issue, because the word structural is typically something where, in fact, we don't talk about the same thing, because for the UNCTAD, for heterodox people, social change maybe precisely to industrialize. This is typically what an heterodox economist will understand as a social change, that is moving from an oil-based economy, commodity-based economy, to an industrialized economy. But social change may also means that this is a state-led economy, like most African economies in the 70s, 80s, and it will, Chile is a good example of that, and we will move entirely to a private sector-led economy. For instance, the Chile reform for pensions, as you know, has been an absolute social change for Chile, and precisely we were talking about this before, that is, it has induced the current government, because suddenly they realized that the system before of pension was the most unequal and unjust system which is possible, and which has been entirely driven by the IFI. So words, as I said, and claim for change, but also ambiguity, enormous ambiguity on the meaning of policies using the same words. As I said, many new facilities, flexible credit line, etc., etc. But I have said in the introduction, always with two countries with already strong policy. What is a strong policy? As I said, an appropriate policy or strong policy. You know exactly what it means. That is, economies which already implement IFI reform. So now the circle is made, you see, and the word strong policy, good policy, you know exactly what it means. And this paper wants to take seriously the use of this word. Okay, for COVID, it has been exactly the same. They said we committed 1 trillion of US dollar, etc. Last month, I mean, very recently, a new facility, Resilience and Sustainability Trust, has been launched also by the IMF, which is seems extremely positive for low-income economies, typically those affected by COVID. And if you read the paragraph, you see it will be on a case-by-case basis, based on the strengths. You see the word strength of reform. We have strong, appropriate, etc. Voilà. Alors now let us move on this concept of change. What is interesting is critical scholars recently published quite a few papers saying, in fact, the IMF is right. Yes, they change. And this is why I was interested by this idea of change, because heterodox scholars such as, Cornell Ban, Gallagher, etc., they also developed quite a few publications saying, in fact, it is true. That is, the IMF observed the detrimental impact of global inequality. The IMF agreed that more state intervention in the economy could be positive, etc., industrial policies, as I said, Cornell Ban, etc. So the IMF is accepting new ideas, new policies, etc. And Eileen Grable, which is a very well-known economist, also made a book precisely on Hirschman, also putting forward the idea that the IMF followed a Hirschmanian change, small incremental change, bottom up rather than top down, etc. So this is why, interestingly, as I said, this is a kind of new consensus. So now let us move, as I said, that is, if we want to understand exactly what is happening, that is, what is the concept of change which is at stake. I see that I'm late. Yes, we started quite late, so I can talk 15 minutes. So what could be the conceptualization of change for having strong tools to analyze change? So as I said, in evolutionary theory, à la Kuhn, change can be conceived in a, let's say, saltist perspective, really jumps, quantum jump, absolute radical type of changes, typically threshold phase transition in physics, from ice to water, which is a definition of a phase transition. So Douglas North, Gould, etc., describe that as a punctuated equilibria. So you have different perspectives, but the idea is radical change in nature. This is a particular view of change. So, for instance, in evolutionary theory, language, interestingly, the appearance of language as represented for the human, for the animals preceding human beings as an absolute radical change. That is, there is an absolute difference in nature between species who have language and species who have not language. You can argue the opposite, by the way. But so far, this is something which is quite accepted. And so, which means that in nature, saltism, quantum jump exist in nature. That is, even the poor apes which were taught language by David Premack and others could learn, let's say, 300, 400 words, but we all discovered that, in fact, something was missing, which is language. And it has been horrible because these poor apes, by the way, died extremely unhappy because, in fact, they could not go back to the condition of being apes. And there were plenty of experiments in the 90s. So it exists. There are change which can be absolutely threshold change versus, as I said, gradualist type of change. So revolution versus gradualist. Small innovations, so I repeat. Time frame, I already mentioned that, which is quite important. And Brodel position, I already mentioned quickly from historian. And Joanna, I hope you will add plenty of comments, which is long time, medium term, short term. And Brodel famously argued that geography is typically what produce long-term type of evolutions. The economy would be a kind of medium-term type of evolution, and politics. As I said, I think now we know that it is a bit more complex, and again, that geography, this is quite complex. Geography can be changed overnight by a policy, so things are much more complex. The relationship between, for instance, geography, policy, institution are much more complex. You build a dam, for instance, in Africa, or whatever. To build a dam overnight, a dam is not built overnight, but quickly, you have a completely different geography. That is, immediately with this dam can come bilharzios, new disease, for instance, population, new settlements, etc. That is, in fact, it is much more complex than to understand that we have geography, long-term, etc. But at least let us insist on the fact that change implies different temporalities and change. Another issue I didn't mention in the introduction regarding change is, of course, the scale of analysis. And the scale of analysis, of course, will change completely your view of as something change or not. That is, do you concentrate, for instance, if you are an economist, on reduction, a model. That is, you are a scientific person, you consider that plenty of events, empirical events, are just empirics, that is just anecdote empirics. You want to build a model, a reductionist of a reality. You would like just to keep, let's say, 3 variables, that y is a function of a and b by definition, and which is a very legitimate exercise. That is, you want to make a model of something. Usually, do you agree, if you make a model of something, your view of change will be quite minimal, because change will be a kind of pollution, a parasite in your analysis, you see, if you want to model. And again, economists typically are in this view, but it can be a political scientist. If you want to make a model of elections, of a model of polarization in Europe in the late, I don't know, early 21st century, of course, you get rid of plenty of events, you consider them as a parasite in your analysis, and you try to keep only 2 or 3 variables, and you will try to establish a causality between the variables. Here, the notion of change will be reduced technically immediately. And this is something very familiar to you. If you are interested not in being a model, for instance, for comparative views, but you are much more interested in case study, you would like to make a book on Mozambique after decolonization, for instance, and you are not at all interested by building a model, it is clear that here your conception of change will appear much more clearly than in, and this is, by the way, in social science, one of the opposition between comparative objective or case studies, which is a very old traditional opposition and which is a serious problem. That is, do we build analysis in order to compare Korea and Ethiopia? For instance, we would like to make a book on the developmental state, and we try to extract only what is permanent, common to Korea in the 70s and Ethiopia today, for instance, for trying to say both are developmental state, etc. So this is a comparatist view, which is very legitimate in social science, or you want to make a book on the history of Ethiopia or the history of Korea or China, and you are like Barry Norton saying that nothing in the Chinese experience can be compared to anything, and certainly not the Chinese developmental state can be transposed or translated in Africa. Do you see that here you have a very legitimate difference, and your view of change, your view will be very different. I just wanted to highlight that valuing reductionist for comparative view, or observing the wealth of reality, which is another view, and Joanne, as an historian, you know how this is a tension which is important, will comment your understanding of change. Of course, you have also another view, which I like very much, which is theories of past dependence, which is Paul David. You know what is past dependence, which is a very interesting theory promoted by Brian Arthur, Paul David, and others. If you think that this type of perspective is a relevant one, in this case, your view of change will be limited, because if you believe, which is a bit my case, that in fact past dependence comment at T0 what will happen at T plus 1, T plus 2, etc., you are not quite optimistic on the capacity of system to change. You see, you focus much more on inertia of systems, etc. So, and of course, I conclude this section on change, and I have to accelerate that, of course, your conception of change varies according to the object of your analysis. If you analyze the change, I don't know, of a balloon, for instance, you will see that the balloon has become a square or whatever. So you will observe for a simple object easily a change. But usually objects are complex. Usually they are composite, be it an object or a concept or event or whatever. And here it is really difficult if you want to analyze change. That is, your question will be, what is contingent and what is a necessary element of that particular institution? You take democracy, what is a necessary criterion of democracy and what is a contingent element of democracy? And if you try to understand if an object is a complex one, composite, in fact, some element can change, but some element cannot change, you see. And it depends completely on, in this particular object, typically in institution, it is really difficult to analyze what has changed. I mean, we all know this, because we can say democracy in Athens in the 5th century before Christ. In fact, what is common with democracy in Portugal? There are elements. But at the same time, we feel that there may be big difference. So this is an example. What has changed between Athens and Portugal? But at the same time, we feel that there are plenty of elements which are common. So I just wanted to highlight that depending on what the object of your analysis, you will have enormous difficulties in analyzing a change because objects are usually complex objects, institutional. And in fact, of course, so I skip this. So now I have 10 minutes and language. So language.
Is 1 hour past. 1 hour.
Yeah, exactly. So give me 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Because I would like now to give 15 minutes. So exactly. So I will try to 15 minutes to insist on the issue of language.
20 minutes.
Okay. In any case, you can say at least stop. So now, what is the introduction of let's say a new perspective for providing tools for understanding change? I mean, whether change has taken place or not. So this section is focusing on language, and in fact, underscoring that language per se, not as a neutral tool or transparent tool, but language per se can help us to understand the possibility of a change or not. And I use Orwell, so the famous Newspeak analyze, and so incredibly wonderful analysis of Orwell of what is Newspeak. And I will take seriously the issue of language for going back to the IFI language. You remember what Orwell put forward in his book, 1984, the Newspeak. What is Newspeak? Freedom is slavery, you remember, war is peace, black is white. And the extract from the sentence of Orwell is even worse. I take the pleasure to quote, black-white means the ability to believe that black is white, and more to know, the word to know that black is white, and to forget that one ever believed the contrary. And this is exactly what is at stake, you see, what is. And I was mentioning the famous book by Victor Klemperer, LTI, Lingua Terci Imperii, which is in Portuguese or French, the language of the Third Reich, of the Nazi language. And Klemperer, who was a linguist, a philolog, made a famous rediscovered analysis of the Nazi language and saying that all totalitarian regime absolutely need to create a new speak, a new language for people, precisely as Orwell is saying, ever forgetting that there was a time where black was not white. So this is, I have no time for insisting, but I would like to use this analysis for trying to understand that, in fact, the language which is put forward by the IFI is completely using this type of mechanism. So change is also a perception within a relationship between A and B, let's say the IFI and the African government. And I just wanted to say that the language which is used by the IFI vis-à-vis borrowing government is a modality of a newspeak and the associated regime of persuasion. This is quite important. That is also, you have to convince the government, and I will show in which way, for precisely inducing mechanisms that efficiently convince that there has been a change within institution, governance, etc., conceptual framework, and policies. So what is common to any modality of newspeak or this type of language, saying, I will give you some example. It is asymmetry. That is, in the Orwell book, there is an asymmetry. Of course, there is a power relationship. Because for you to believe that black is white, on that budget deficit is good for growth, or trade openness is good for growth, you have to be persuaded and you have to believe it. But what is intrinsic to this belief is that there is an intrinsic asymmetry because the government is not equal to the IMF. You see, in any device of persuasion and convincing, there is power. Because of course, you cannot be convinced rarely by somebody who is subordinate vis-à-vis you. That is, power is an absolutely intrinsic dimension of the device of persuasion. That is, for you to believe that black and white or trade openness is good for growth. Of course, there is an intrinsic asymmetry. What is this asymmetry? This is a credit relationship. That is, you need the money of the IMF. Otherwise, you will not call the IMF to help you to rescue your commodity sector, etc. So I put it very quickly, but I just wanted to give you the different tools of analysis of why language is something really important in a Orwellian, so the use of IFI of a newspeak relies on different elements. I have unfortunately to accelerate. That is the tool of, it should be a persuasion device. So first, it has to be presented as true, okay? This is very important, but the truth of concept, that is the IFI use true concept, the mechanism I present to you, which is trade openness is good for growth, not only the concept is true, so I would say legitimate, mechanism adjustment is good for growth, etc., should be true. And as I said, the qualification, that is a structural reform, contingent facility, should be considered as true. This is quite important. The second thing is on the world of policy. The policy has to be presented as effective. And do you agree that effectiveness and truth are not exactly the same? That is, they should be presented as true, but the policy has to be presented as effective. So typically, give me a few minutes more because we have to, fiscal deficit are bad for growth. This is extract from the IFI literature. Pension increase the fiscal deficit. Liberation foster growth. Laying off civil servant improves the fiscal balance. Flexibility of employment foster growth. Layoff means safeguarding employment. You see, there is no limit in this type of description. You see, and you see the importance of language. It has to be presented as true causality. This is very, very important. And at the policy level, structural, as I said, austerity has to be called fiscal consolidation. Do you see that is in the world of policy? It is really important also. Nobody will contradict the fiscal consolidation, you see? Okay, so what is in the name? Just to accelerate, that is, what do you read in this mechanism? That is, the reference are ambiguous. What is technically called in linguistics the reference of a word, that is unemployment, rigidity, liberalization, austerity, protection, safety nets, etc., are intrinsically ambiguous. The ambiguity is absolutely necessary to the functioning of this causality. This is the key point why language is so important. That is, given they are ambiguous, they can be used in different contexts all the time, the same words, but with different meanings. Because if they are ambiguous, they are relevant in any context, in Portugal or in Côte d'Ivoire or in Greece or whatever. That is, ambiguous reference are the key mechanism of the functioning of this power relationship and for the government to accept this type of causality. I accelerate. Ambiguity of meanings allow for multiple interpretation, ambiguity, and it means also that IFI, by the way, absorb a lot of social science, anthropology, today sociology, etc. This is quite important because in absorbing social science, presenting themselves IFI as open to other social science, what they do for now 5 years about, of course, they present inequality, etc., society, cognitive science. Now there is even a World Development Report on cognitive science, etc., which means that they add new words coming from other social science, which are new layers in the ambiguity of words because they are typically borrowed from other social science, in which they have a different meaning. You agree? Because inequality in anthropology has not the same meaning as inequality in economics. What does it mean in terms of power? It means that here the asymmetry of the relationship and the ambiguity of the reference provides mechanisms of irrefutability. This is exactly where power is. That is, irrefutability is inherent in any newspeak type of device. That is, newspeak can last because the entity imposing this type of word has the power. Otherwise, the government, the African government would say, I don't believe a single word of what you say, and please go home. But precisely, they can't. because we are in an asymmetric credit relationship. So the credit relationship. So I accelerate, and I just wanted to conclude this section on language. That is, for instance, as I said, the semantic is important, the truth logic, but the pragmatic, that is, etc. So I already said that. So I just wanted to finish this section, and then I will move to Africa quickly. That is, assertion must be true. And what is important? That is, as I said, I insist on that. You have a truth value, which is important, and also it has to be presented as effective, which is a word of policy. How can you make that the adressé believes that it is true? Mathematics. This is exactly where math and modeling comes. That is, nobody will contest a mathematical model. And this is why I wanted to insist here that math, everybody is angry against math, modeling. There are billions of papers saying, excess modeling is ridiculous, etc. Mainstream economics is based on excessive modeling. But I just wanted to highlight that in the description I made of the intervention of language, math is an absolute necessary tool, because you can contest what I say. Okay, but if I were presenting only a question, it would be much more difficult for you to contest what I say. And this is what I say is absolutely not contingent, that in fact, IFI rely on academic literature, which is based on math, because math provides a truth value of what they say, which is absolutely crucial for the functioning of this asymmetric relationship. This is really what I wanted to say. Anyway, you will, and also the community of language, because this is quite important. As you know, African government usually come from Harvard, MIT, or whatever, because it is absolutely crucial also in this device that when they talk in mission to Angola or whatever, that is, they talk to people who are sharing, of course, exactly the same content. They don't talk to civil societies saying, go to hell because you are just creating a shortage or whatever. And if it is the case, they just finance an NGO, which will talk, by the way, exactly the same language. It is absolutely a crucial device. So I hope you will give, we'll get the PowerPoint because I showed it. And this is why also mainstream economics, IFI, absolutely need the legitimacy provided by economists, academic economists. That is, it is quite crucial for the IFI to have economists who publish in American Economic Review or in mainstream journals. That is, otherwise they are fired from the research department, because it is extremely important that this truth value is validated by what is providing truth, which is science. That is, the two IFI need a research department. This is quite important, and they are not only made from policymakers, you see, because precisely they give the truth value, which is absolutely necessary for the asymmetry to function. Now I move to Africa in 5 minutes, but you will recognize. So as I said, I gave you some elements of understanding, and then, as I said, let us trap the IFI to their own perspective, consequentialist. And I accelerate, and I just wanted to say that what are the real outcomes, and you will see exactly, let us take Africa. We see that here, the structure of merchandise export in Africa is absolutely the worst, which is possible compared to other economies. That is the least export of manufacture compared to any developing economies. And you see, compare, for instance, 2000 and 20 years later, you see it is exactly the same figure. And in fact, the figures show that it is even getting worse, because African economies export even more raw materials such as ore and metals, 20%, 8% in 2000. Fuels are incredibly important and remain extremely important. And figures are broadly unchanged, and compared to East Asia, for instance, and compare even to the whole world, you see, that is 70% manufacture and 27% for Africa, etc. Look at this. So, and I will finish in 5 minutes. This is the consequentialist. You see that after 50 years of adjustment, we don't see very visibly the improvement. Look at this, stability of outcomes. We can see that the GDP per capita is in fact extremely stable in Sub-Saharan Africa, and growth is very erratic, and by the way, following commodity prices. And as I said here, that is, if change occurred, it was not due to policy reform, but to China, typically the demand of China. You see, that is even which have nothing to do with IFI policies. This is the most depressing graph I was mentioning in the introduction. If you see Africa with difficulty, this is normal, because Africa is, look, this is Africa. It's quite, and this graph is, I think, not needing any comment. This is exactly, of course, it is aggregated. We will discuss that. We can take the glass half full or half empty, because I agree, it is possible to say that, in fact, the United States are outliers. That is, maybe high growth economy have a behavior which may be exceptional, etc. So just consequentialist view, let us take outcomes seriously. You see that, in fact, this language, this linguistic device are, in fact, masking in a consequentialist view, realities which have nothing to do with this claim of change. And I conclude here, that is, the limited change, the change have been extremely limited. Not only the outcomes in a consequentialist view, the outcomes are not at all confirming what is claimed, but let us take seriously the theories and the policies of the IFI. And here this section claimed for absolute stability. This is Côte d'Ivoire document in 2016. And you don't have time to read, but you immediately see this type of literature. You see additional tax revenue mobilization, low debt, stability, consolidation, fiscal consolidation, etc., etc. You take Côte d'Ivoire 20 years before, I promise the sentence are exactly the same, which is, I think, something vertiginous. This is really vertigineux. En anglais, non. Vertige. Vertige. You say. Exactly. So, and this is significant reform of public administration, budgeting process, etc. Not only time, but space. Let us take Senegal, for instance, 1995. You see objective rate of inflation, reduce the overall fiscal deficit, cut public expenditure, trade liberalization, modernization, etc. Let us take Greece, 2015, and we see fiscal policy, rebalancing the budget, etc., etc. This is something I would say, I mean, if you are looking for subject of dissertation of PhD, this is really a mystery. I insist, this is something which is, again, we cannot say these people are ideological or stupid or whatever. This is something, and I think this focus I wanted to have on language, I hope you realize that something is happening. I conclude, and the device of conditional learning is exactly the same. So, and conditionality is exactly the same. That is Article 5 of the IMF, which is saying that conditionality is an intrinsic core device of any financing, has not changed. And it has even aggravated and accelerated. That is, a number of conditions has even increased over the last 20 years. Okay. And this is a famous work by Celtic Hellenis, who is really interesting. The model is exactly the same. And this is the last slide. So what can we say? That is, the constituency, the governance is exactly the same. Africa has only 2 seats because it reflects the voting power. So this is the last slide. I conclude in saying that, yes, poor economies seems in fact in a consequentialist view, much more caught in a locking type device and cumulative causation that is precisely more path dependence, because we have to explain that. And as I said, the consequentialist perspective suggests much more that than even what heterodox scholars say or mainstream. And so why, as I said, I don't have the explanation, why such a stability over the last 4 decades? I tried to highlight that we should take language seriously as a possibility to understand the device and the mechanism of this. That is, language is an intrinsic dimension of putting forward, in fact, absolute stability of the policies, and at the same time, claiming for change because of the ambiguity of the reference. You see, this is quite important. So why such a stability? My hypothesis, which is, I think, trivial, is just to say that, in fact, international conditions have not changed. And in fact, global financialization has not changed. That is, the world as it is since, let's say, the Big Bang of the 80s is extremely stable. That is, dominance of the mainstream economics, financialization of the global economy, which is really creating incredibly strong asymmetries between creditors and borrowers, you see, which is really important. And driver of change in policies are quite limited. And so always through language device, consolidate this type of asymmetry. I'm very sorry, it's 20 and I stop. Sorry for the language.
I suppose that there are some questions. This is a very important reflection on epistemology of economy, of this research. And I remember that all these questions are important when in Europe, after the 2008 crisis, we in Europe, European economists and Portuguese economists discuss what happens, what was the solution for the crisis in Portugal, in the peaks, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And at that time, economists that work on Africa stabilization, we used to say it was important that they learn what happens in Africa, because the device was exactly the same. What we apply in the peaks, Portuguese, Italy, Greece, and was exactly the same device that we study in this master for since the 90s, all the knowledge of the special adjustment on this kind of disaster. Of course, it's interesting to see how these work in the same way. And of course, in academical way, we must understand all these kinds of epistemology of the construction of knowing and policies, and how these work, and how this power, what is the power of the policies, how these kind of tools can work and are so stable, and it's very interesting. So even to understand not only in our case, we study mainly Sub-Saharan Africa, but we have to look at this in Latin America, because the structural adjustment began in Latin America also. And then in Latin America. So it was Latin America, it was Africa, Sub-Saharan, and then finally it was in South Europe after the crisis. And
exactly.
It was interesting to put together economists that work in the both fields.
Absolutely.
So there are some questions. So Vincent, how are you? Fine.
Let me welcome you after a long time. I have a few points I want to actually pick out. From your last discussion with us in 2016 till now, I have not seen so much changes to realities. Your papers were actually captivating, but it lacks the freedom to attach itself with contemporary realities. If you realize what has been happening globally, before we come down to regional level, there has been certain points of departures that have led to certain changes in policies, in practices, in realities on ground. I do community-based research, and I do also at the moment I'm working on shocks and fragilities. Yes. And if you look at what's been happening since the COVID-19 pandemic, we notice that even in the IFIs there has been change from the conditionalities. Most countries would not want to adopt conditionalities, and the IMF itself had to tell itself the truth. The IMF came out to poorer countries to tell them that they are giving them loans not based on any conditionalities. They give out loans to several countries without conditions. The IMF, as well as every other IFI, the IFIs generally have realized the weakness of conditionalities in most countries. The failures in Lebanon, the failures in Argentina, the failures in Nicaragua, the failures in several countries, Greece included, even Italy here. These failures has succeeded in weakening their strength to argue globally. And we see the strength of China's growth, for example. It is contrary to what we have from SAP. SAP in the 1980s were sold to us in Africa. It continued down through the 90s. In Nigeria, we survived terribly. 1985, we accepted SAP. We didn't survive it in 1995. For over a decade, we were almost lost out. So you see, at the end of the day, the relevance of these financial institutions becomes a question. Are they really relevant? Are they really helping? Or are they just there to serve others as well? You see, this argument keeps coming up. There is the issue of, there is a challenge, you know very well the issue with the Washington consensus, the post-Washington consensus and all that. And up to today, what will happen as millennium, after millennium development goal, now sustainable development goal. And all these years have not really addressed seriously the challenges of these countries. And secondly, you relied on GDP for analysis. Prof, if you remember, GDP is a fluid, today it is a fluid instrument. There are several other realities that measure change, not based on a single metric, but based on realities on ground. Sociologically, there have been several alternatives. GDP cannot be a straitjacket instrument of comparison. More so, you in this presentation, this wonderful presentation, I must attest, there has been the same Eurocentric idea of looking at Africa as one country.
I had no time for taking country by country.
54 realities, 54 differences, 54 cultures, more than 54 cultures. Like in Nigeria, for example, we have over 400 languages. We have over 200 and something ethnic identities. We cannot use one same yardstick to measure all of them at the same time. This happens also with fragilities. If you look at fragile economies, there are different realities to every economy. Some countries are dependent on crude oil, some are dependent on some other commodities, some themselves are even suffering from now the upcoming shock, which is climate change. We've survived, we've managed to survive COVID-19. We've managed to survive the effect of Russia in the world. If we think that Russia's effect is just about Ukraine war, no. It began in Africa in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in most of our African countries in the past 2 years have gone through a series of coup d'etats, which were a thing of the history. But because of China's influence, it has created a new path of dependence in Africa. Same thing is likely to happen here in Europe, where with this Ukrainian war, we do not know where this proliferation of weapons will lead European economies and security into the nearest future. That's why the EU has changed its narrative. The EU has never bothered going into security, but this time it is going into security. Of course, realizing with the experience of Africa, after the fall of Gaddafi, the proliferation of weapons has created terrorism. It has created lots of crimes in most Sub-Saharan trading routes. And most of these countries are not better off to date. It has affected economically, it has affected socially, it has affected governments as well. these countries are still fighting with the realities of the Libyan invasion, and who knows what's going to happen to Europe after Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we take several questions, or do I? What do you prefer, Joanna? You are the boss, or I answer individually?
You can choose.
No, Joanna. What is? I answer individually, or
No, okay.
do you have time? Yeah, I think it's better because we still have half an hour. So, just to say, and then I will not forget. I completely agree, but let me answer. Yes, there are. I took a very aggregate view because I mean I have 1 hour for talking about extremely huge subject, and Africa. I am the first to say that Africa is not a country. This is absolutely obvious, and I insist that there are commonalities but huge difference. But it was not I would say the topic of the paper, as you've seen. And just your first point was to say without conditionalities. I would say yes and no, because I read recently, precisely the recent, if you go to the website, as I said, of the IMF, I was, again, in aggregate perspective, struck by the fact that, in fact, always a small music I mentioned, which is usually below the announcement of the facility, was always 2 countries with good policies. And this is why, of course, maybe in specific issues, I don't know, Ukraine or Lebanon or whatever, but again, I agree, there are a lot of specificities, but we could argue that, in fact, what I call the leitmotif, the small music behind, is still there. That is, conditional lending is still there. That is, 2 countries which are implementing the so-called, and this is why I insist on language, strong policies, good policy, whatever. It is not to contradict what you said. That is, this international institution, again, I insist, arguments such as psychological or Marxist argument or pure exploitation or whatever are excessive arguments. These institutions are made of people who think, extremely well paid for thinking. And they may, in some specific case, perfectly understand, and I agree with you, that in some cases they must adapt quite brutally, because otherwise they will pay it also, because they may, as you say, disappear, etc. But I just wanted to highlight that, in fact, the stability, we can agree that there is some stability of the conditional lending. And the IFI, as I said, I have no time for that, because they are institutions, incredibly legal institutions, with, as you know, 189 stakeholder countries which are members, which are in fact governance of the IMF, with article of agreement, and conditional lending is part of the article of agreement. That is, the freedom, the room for maneuver of the IMF, and you're right, I mean, we should be much more subtle, is quite limited. That is, legally, I mean, the legal department of the IMF is a full floor, I mean, as important as the financial department. They absolutely don't have the right to suddenly say, I will take international savings, because the money of the IMF is international saving. This is your saving, my saving, to distribute to what they wish. And this is what you have, a very inert type of structure, because, for instance, changing the quota structure, when China say, I'm sorry, I exist, so could you change the governance? And they say it took 10 years for doing this, because, and again, it's not the subject of the paper, but it is a political institution with internal politics, and every big, the big chairs, the US, etc., the UK, etc., don't have at all the intention to admit new members, as you know, etc. So this is just to say the big picture maybe is a picture of stability. Second thing, irrelevance weakening. This has happened, and this is exactly the point. That is, it has happened. Remember, before the financial crisis, you had plenty of papers saying the IMF is an irrelevant structure, because in fact it was were years of growth. China was there. China was ready to say, I can make a check for every economy in need, and there had been some panic and you have very interesting figure even within the IMF. If you see the evolution of IMF lending in the 2000s, it was really decreasing. And of course, it is exactly the point that is an institution which is financial, which is not lending, collapse. It's like a bank. You see, so a financial institution must lend for surviving because you know that it is recycling with interest rate, international savings. But thanks to the global financial crisis, the IMF came back to the agenda. And suddenly, immediately after 2008, and the COVID has been a wonderful event for that, that is, suddenly the crisis is so gigantic, so crazy, and not only for the economies, but here as well, that international financial institutions are completely back to the agenda, which means that in fact what you say, yes, but it is of course depending on the international environment. We don't know what will be the future in the next months, what will happen, because we are in a very critical context today, and it may be possible that the IFI are here for a long time, you see, because precisely that. So this is the second point. The relevance today, I think, is more. And of course, GDP and to aggregate, I wanted to, I'm the first to say that the GDP per capita is incredibly, especially for 50 so economies, completely aggregate, but it doesn't change. And I absolutely agree that what is taking place in South Africa has nothing to do with, I don't know, what takes place in Guinea-Bissau. But at the same time, I think these graphs are made for shocking, just to wake you up, because, and in fact, just highlighting that whatever the internal change in Nigeria, South Africa, Angola, I mean, countries are huge. Let us take DR Congo. I mean, DR Congo is how many times the size of France? I mean, there is no relationship between what is taking place in Goma or Kinshasa or Rwanda is a completely heterogeneous economy compared. But at the same time, the question remains, seems to me, that why such a divergence with the rest of the world? You see, that is whatever the change. And it is exactly the issue of change as I was mentioning before. That is what is taking place, for instance, in Kano, of course, has nothing to do with what is taking place in, I don't know, Windhoek, for instance. I think really. And the issue is, which is a mystery, that is, if we, as I said in the section on change, if it depends on your point of entry, your scale of analysis. If we take a very big picture analysis, we are very far. What we observe is something which has commonalities, because I put the, and which is the divergence. And as I said in the conclusion, the explanations are quite many, but there is a picture of divergence, which taking the big picture allows to take. But I completely agree with you that if I go to, I don't know, Nicaragua or Honduras or whatever, in fact, I will observe exactly the same thing. You see, and I have other papers comparing very aggregate Latin America and Africa. And I completely agree that under some respect, commodity dependence, we see that the trajectory of lack compared to SSA is incredibly close, which is interesting. That is, I'm not at all, especially Latin America, but I take your point that is a more fine-grained picture would see much more difference, and a more aggregate picture would see more commonalities with other parts of the world, and typically Latin America. I think this is, I completely take your point.
As well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
not a question, but something to share. I'm used to work and still working for civil society organizations, and it's really hard to try to convince the governments that this kind of politics they are financing, they're not good, or they are not enough to change our reality. And I think we have some struggle in explaining or just challenging what they are, what they are showing that it's going to be the benefits.
Mhm.
They are saying in one phrase what is what they are going to change in our realities, and we are just trying to debate the meaning of poverty or the meaning of education. What civil society should do to actually have more clues to face this kind of discourse or this kind of, because it's difficult, and they are using math, they are using a lot of things. We should have more economists with us. We should have another kind of showing what we would like to do different, and what could we do to do that?
No, it's a very, if I understand you, I mean, you are stumbling exactly on what I said, the importance of language, but I would say not only language, in fact, because the question goes beyond language. But so you say it's very difficult to convince governments. What type of civil society organization? I mean, are you based on environment, or what is your focus? Because it depends on the focus. The capacity of persuasion depends on your object.
I used to work in an organization, specifically an example with education.
Yes.
So the World Bank was trying to convince the government that they should invest in early ages, because it will reflect in some. It is true, but they were saying that the problem was managing, not the payment of professors or the quality of education. It's really simple. If you want.
So the focus of the donors, because here you change the subject, it's not government, but you say the World Bank. You see, you change your focus. You say it's very difficult to convince governments, but at the same, just immediately you said it is difficult to convince the World Bank.
Oh, sorry, because they were presenting this as a way out of improving our education.
You have much more the World Bank in mind, or governments? The World Bank.
The government, because
government, but government as influenced by the World Bank. Exactly. So I think that what I presented gave you at least some analytical tools, because if you have the PowerPoint, I went into more even in details to take even very concrete examples, that is emissions in government, that is, you have to see this like a movie, it's like a theater, that is all in the same hotel, 20 people who are in their room with a computer calculating budget deficit or whatever. So they go to ministries. Very often they are even more numerous than the number of civil servants who are in the ministry, because you have sometimes a mission of 50 people, you see invading the Department of Education or whatever. I mean, this is really like a theater, which it happened that I participated in that. And I was really struck by precisely the language, the device, the general device of. So at least I can give you some tools for understanding that language is really, really important. And you said, I think you said it, that is, it seems to me that using the use of the same language, what linguists could say, the same pragmatic, the same conversation, the same premises, the same hypothesis, the same language. And this is not only for the subject of today, it is in life in general. It is in any, and Joanna, you will confirm because you work on that, in any rebellion movement, in any contestation movement, you know how heterogeneity of language or commonality of language is absolutely crucial in any power relationship. I mean, between the poor and rich, that is, the poor can talk, but if you have a language which is not common to the exploiter or whatever, it is simply not listened to. I don't understand you. What is this language? I mean, I don't understand what they say, etc. Look how the language they have, which is, you agree, the absolute root of contempt. You see, and it is even the same for poor people in the 19th century Europe, when they started to claim for create unions or whatever. So language is extremely important. And you raise a question which is absolutely crucial, that is, either NGO talk ordinary language, this is, or you would say, or civil servant could say, but what is this new speak? I mean, sustainable development, what else? Sustainable resilience, desertification, whatever. And you just say, oh, primary, etc., rebalancing gender inequality. So, and if the problem is, if you don't talk this language, you will get no money from international.
Even in the project, you must, in the research project, you must use.
Absolutely, absolutely, and you will get no money. And this is why you have a lot of chambre d'éco. You see in NGO, I mean, once I work in a country, the local NGO, I was completely struck because I had the impression to have robots just with a key in the back reciting the World Bank keys. And in fact, I had very many of them were students from Sorbonne, so they could be my students. And they had no choice, because if they wanted some money from any donor, if you just, like you mean, take the table and just put the table out of the window, you will get no money. So people are pragmatic, because they say if they want to exist, they have to talk this language. But your point is absolutely crucial in the sense, 2 points. In the sense that you are completely trapped. Either I need money to exist, because otherwise I can talk in my apartment and have wonderful ideas, but okay, it will be completely autistic, or I want to become Oxfam, or a good example, and Oxfam is a good example because many people from Oxfam are now working for the World Bank. So you see how, in fact, it is very easy to be trapped. You see, or you talk exactly the same language, but you know perfectly well, if you are young and not completely transformed by World Bank keys, that what you say is in fact factice. Do you say factice in Portuguese? Facticité, just fake. The fake is not factice. So I don't have a solution because you see, and the only thing, for instance, you could use other disciplines, but this device, which is a linguistic device, but also a power device, because the title, is in fact that even if you come and say that, it's a concrete example I had in Niger, it's film, I should not. Decades ago, I participated in a mission by chance in Niger, and they wanted to create public toilets in the capital city. And so I will never forget that, because as a small person, but I say it's not possible because public toilets mixed, male and female, publicly in Niamey, it's pointless. I mean, they didn't even know what was Ramadan. Remember? I mean, it's so. And in fact, they are not stupid, maybe because it was irrelevant in the device. Why? Remembering that it's Ramadan, it's not relevant for. And I remember that there was some sociologists, anthropologists saying, you know, anthropologically speaking, I mean, this is just pointless. And think about, nobody will use your public toilets in a Muslim country. It's ridiculous. Just wait. And they could not hear. This is exactly because there are sociologists who know them, there are anthropologists. And this is going even beyond what you said. They are inside the institution. It's not even outside NGO. But when you read, please read, go, it's public to the website and read the sociological papers of the World Bank, you will not recognize what is anthropology or sociology, because it is completely like viande hachée, comme on dit. You say viande hachée, you put meat and you, what the final outcome has become the local language. So I'm quite pessimistic on that, but I try to be optimistic in the sense that maybe you can be Hirschmanian and for other reasons. That is, threshold effect can come. That is, I think for the climate change issue, things will become what we were talking about so unbearable quickly, that in fact suddenly they will, oh my God, there is an NGO who mentioned that half of the country will be inundated, or etc. But it comes to my second point, your question, in fact, forget nothing to say because it's just politics and political science. And here, the linguistic device, what I try to say, is completely part of power relationship. People will listen to you from the very moment it will enter the political agenda. No more, no less. And suddenly, you will become Oxfam, or you will become Save the Children, or whatever. So suddenly, they will, in a general political agenda, discover that if they are not taking into account a particular point, I don't know, that women, or that, for instance, they should stop the focus on primary schools and maybe take university into account, which is unthinkable currently for the World Bank, because I don't know, let us imagine a world where all students will go on the streets and make a revolution, which is not something completely unthinkable. That is suddenly, for political reasons, they will change. They say, oh my God, university should be financed, you see, and I think it is exactly what I wanted to highlight. That is either a lacune revolution, and which can create change, and there can be a revolution. There have been in Africa, we have coup in some, we have Sudan, for instance, which is quite a tough situation because in Sudan every week we have people who are killed. And so some analysts of Sudan said nothing will change because the surrounding economies, the countries will never allow any change, which is a pessimistic view. But at the same time, I do think that what is happening in Sudan is really bringing some hope, because nobody could imagine after the freezing of the previous decades. You see, so it is possible also to have a civil society beyond NGO who is going on the streets and say, let's change. Remember the emblematic picture in Sudan of these young women. Newsweek, of course, the West was absolutely so happy to present like a sirene. So this is the West. But you see, I think in your answer you have two elements. The element of the, and you said the math. This is absolutely crucial. And in this case, you have some room for maneuver on the linguistic side, which is that, okay, you hire, as you said, a Nobel Prize, Joseph Stiglitz, or whatever, and as a research head of the research department. And why not saying my math is better than yours, which, by the way, is a strategy. That is, if you take seriously the commonality of language, some heterodox thinkers, but you see the results are not even listened to. Many heterodox economists are much better in math than mainstream thinkers. And they come and they say there is a mistake in the equation. Your premises, even a student first year would not do something like that. And what is interesting, we say in French, the rabbit out of the hat is always the same at the end. That is, okay, my math is bad, but what I say is true. And do you see here, we have a pure power relationship.
Is there some time?
Yeah, please.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm from the Masters of Development and Operation here at the university. It's kind of a question / comment as well. I am particularly interested in the United Nations and criticism that can be done to the United Nations. I have been more focused on the financial models regarding United Nations and local governments, such as Brazil, which is where I'm from. But while I was watching a presentation, I was able to access another frustration that I have. I worked at the United Nations for a few years, which is their generic language as a whole. And I would love to hear from you. It's something that is very, I was even remembering, I listened to this international politics podcast that always uses many phrases and they classify it as this is our really moment, and they catch Antonio Guterres' speech that is all full of obvious mentions, and they're like, okay, so this goes to our really folder of information. And I keep seeing that all the time in the organization that I was a part of. Like we are going through a particular crisis, and you see their posts on social media saying, "This is a very hard crisis, and we recommend that this is resolved, quick matter." So I would love to hear from you if you have any observations regarding this redundance, not only a lack of change, but a redundance on language, and if only to include also something that fascinates me is when change is institutionalized. So in the case of the United Nations, the reform of the United Nations is something that is institutionalized, and you can find it on our website, and you can see everything that it's planning to be doing with a lot of the news speak way of talking about. So I would love to hear from you when it comes to institutionalizing change. Does that make a difference or not? And so that's.
But it is a bit anyway. It is quite close to the previous questions. That is the two pillars of this journal. There are more than two, but let's say what I wanted to insist on, which is the issue of language. I don't know other research having focused, because exactly what you say, everybody notices that, especially people who have worked for NGO or within the World Bank or United Nations, but people skip that and say, okay, it is a contingent element, which is a bit embarrassing, because you just fall asleep in meetings saying, because it is always the same words, you see, which is very terrible, a meeting. So what I wanted to say, to take seriously, because I just wanted to say that it is a part of the device, which is, let's say, a persuasion power or persuasion or convincing device. And linguistics is quite useful for that, because the discipline in linguistics, which is called pragmatics, which is the art of conversation or communication, is quite focused on this issue. But again, linguistics is not politics, so we are, that is, linguistics is not interested by asymmetry. So to go back to the United Nations, it is exactly the same. That is, the United Nations can be identified to IFI, but with a big difference. That is, the power of United Nations vis-a-vis member government is extremely limited, because it's not a financial institution, so the credit relationship doesn't exist. But at the same time, there is this asymmetry, because the United Nations has a lot of impact, for instance, in providing soldiers in particular countries, that is, or monitoring elections, etc. That is, power asymmetry doesn't go only through the financial arm. So, which means that what I say, I think, is completely identical for the United Nations, but with a big caveat that, of course, the United Nations is not a lending institution. But again, I insist, many economies need the United Nations precisely for DDR or whatever program, etc. So it is the same. At the same time, the same issue, the second pillar, which is the reform of internal governance. It's not at all my domain, but what I was saying to you, that is, there will be change, but for other reasons. For other reasons, that is, at a certain point, this institution may change. So far, I don't think we observe much change. The language is incredibly robotic, and if there will be change, again, look at China. China has claimed to have a much more important place reflecting its wealth. And did you see how so many years it has taken? Because here we are in international politics, so we completely change the subject. We are not international relations, but here we move completely to international relations. The United Nations, I would say, is weaker than the IFI, because the governance is one country, one vote. Of course, you have the Conseil de Sécurité, I mean, which is, you have a power, a body, and to be a member of the Security Council is, of course, making a difference. But the governments, as you know, the IFI reflects GDP per capita, which is okay, and this is why Africa has only 2 seats, etc. But again, if it changes, it will reflect changes outside this institution. And we have seen that for China. I insist, the language, your point is really important, but the language has to be, I think, inherently ambiguous. Because if you have, it's a very Wittgensteinian view, that is the intrinsic ambiguity of words, what I call technically the reference. The reference of a word is what it is referring to in linguistics. That is, I use the word, it's a classical example, the morning star. Okay, what is the name of the morning star? The technical, I forgot. The étoile du berger, so the star you see in the morning. And so the classical example from Frege is to say that the reference, you can use 2 words for the same reference. That is, the morning star is the same as the evening star. So you have 2 names, but referring to the same thing. So what is the word refers to an object. I use table, and it is referring to a table. Okay, I mean that particular table. But intrinsically, for many words, the reference is ambiguous because a table, even a table, you say, how can you define a table? Is it something in wood? Is it something with 4 feet or 4? But it can have 5. It can be in metal. You see, it is incredibly difficult to define for any word an exact, necessary, and reference for a particular word. All words are in fact completely ambiguous. It's a very, and if you take love, respect, or any abstract or whatever, I mean, it's a complete disaster.
So there is the example of this, the concept of sustainable development.
Exactly, exactly. And the point is exactly this. That is, instead of just falling asleep during the meeting, which is a normal reaction of sustainable development is good for gender inequality, anti-desertification, and climate change, and usually this is the best sleeping pill. And no, which is true, because attending the meeting, they say, how is it possible? For me, personally, I am really impressed. I just say, I'm blushing, by people who are able to talk hours like this. I think it's really
but you know,
how
but
can
you
they
know,
do this?
but what is interesting, if you read in this school,
if you read
in this school, now you can see, but now in our school we have elections for the president. If you read the program of one of the candidates, and of course, sustainable ISEG is a sustainable development goals, sustainable school for development.
And sustainability.
They put this in the marketing.
You have inclusive growth.
No, it's in the marketing. ISEG is the school for sustainable development. Okay.
And Joanna, for
nothing more.
Joanna, you have also inclusive growth. It should be inclusive. Very important.
So,
and the point is inclusive, but also in France, you have to be more diverse, very diverse. You have also that to include diversity. So, what is extremely important, I think, beyond this, and the same for United Nations, that is to take this seriously and to highlight that this ambiguity is not an accident. And I do feel that it is an absolutely intrinsic element of the general functioning of this institution as power institution. That is, it's not say, oh my God, is it by laziness or whatever, or no other word, but the use of ambiguous, empty words allows, in a Wittgensteinian meaning, to allocate any possible meaning depending on the context. Can you imagine how genial it is to have a word which is filled by context, and it is functioning? And so Wittgenstein, and if you're interested, philosopher of language, And somebody called Grice, who has created pragmatics in linguistics, have demonstrated, and somebody called Saul Kripke, so it's really technical philosophical language, has made incredible books on the notion of proper names and saying that some names in language function as completely empty words, precisely love, God, etc., because it allows the language to function. Precisely because, do you agree that language could not function with only an ambiguous word? It could not reflect the intrinsic ambiguity of real relationship. You see, I mean, it's
of course, and if you think Foucault and les mots et les choses,
different perspectives.
Yes, but in the same les mots et les choses. The word,
but the perspective of Foucault,
it's a different approach, but it's important.
A genius approach, but a bit different. Taking seriously exactly the opposite perspective, which is wonderful, saying that a word creates a reality.
Yes.
And so it is not exactly me. I am more interested by ambiguity of reference as a capacity, precisely because gender diversity, equality, resilience, inclusiveness, etc. It works everywhere, and it is just a scene, a theater, because a real power will be behind the scenes. And Foucault just in the idea of paradigm, in introducing, in showing that new words, new paradigms, new configuration discursive created new realities. That is, for instance, with the idea of panoptic, Bentham, new construction of prison, etc., new gaze, new showing that in fact it is exactly the symmetry that new paradigms started with new words, which is exactly the complementary view. That is, for instance, when Foucault showing that suddenly the subject appeared in religious thinking at the beginning of the Christian time, etc., that suddenly human beings became subject, and so showing that with the idea of subject, a huge political economy, government, etc., of body emerged. That is, if you are a subject, you have to have a consciousness, your guilt immediately appears, etc. So you see, it's a very symmetric, but I'm not Foucault, so.
Okay, so merci beaucoup. Thank you
Thank
so
you very much,
much.
and thank you for your reaction. It is encouraging me.
We will have here in maybe Professor Ma talk to you about this. CEsA organizes a big conference of ARI conference, and then it will be an important moment to